Hello, and welcome to the wonderful world of sewing and quilting on your new white sewing machine. I'm Sue Hausman, host of the America Sews Public Television series, and White Sewing Machines has asked me to teach you how to use your new white 1418. So let's get started. The first thing you'll want to do is to set it on a firm surface. It might be a cabinet like I'm using here, or your kitchen table, or even a card table. Then take the plug, which is attached to the foot control, and you'll want to take the plug and plug it into the socket on the right side of the machine, and it actually has an up and a down, so you'll want to get it in there till it's firmly seated. And then right below that socket is the on-off switch, so I'll turn on my new white sewing machine. Now, once you've done that, the power and the light are on, and I have the foot control. Obviously, I plug the plug into the wall socket. The foot control here on the table, just to show you that when I put my foot on the foot control on the floor, that actually is what makes my white sewing machine sew. The needle go up and down. And the harder I push, the faster it goes. So just keep that in mind, that as you push more slowly. So we'll put that down on the floor, ready to sew. And the first thing we'll want to do is talk a little bit about the machine itself. There is a handle that we use for carrying, very portable, and also a free arm extension. And this piece actually slides off. Just pull it to the left, and you then expose the free arm of the machine, which is great for smaller projects and cuffs. But the other little secret is that your free arm extension hides a little box, and that actually stores all your accessories. And what I like to do, I like to actually leave this box with all my accessories just right next to me as I sew, so that I can get a hold of them handily. Well, the first thing you're going to need to do is to thread your new white sewing machine. And so what we will do is wind a bobbin. Now, this is a bobbin, okay? And this is a pretty basic teaching tape because we know that many of you are brand new to sewing. And that bobbin is going to go onto the bobbin winder, which is on the top of your white sewing machine. So we take it and put it on the winder, and we turn it until it seats down. Now, right now, when I step on the foot control, the needle goes up and down. So what I'm going to do is loosen the hand wheel, and that means to grasp the outer wheel with my left hand and grasp the inner wheel with my right hand and turn till that inner wheel is loose. Now the needle won't go up and down as I wind my bobbin. Place your spool of thread, and there are lots of different types of spools of threads, and the one you use is up to you. It's usually what they have at your store. So just choose the type of thread that you have. We like the polyester wrap dual duty. We like the all polyester for sewing. Quality thread is important though. Don't buy junk thread because you'll have problems with it. All right, bring the thread over to the bobbin winding tension disc. And that's this little round tension disc right here at the top. Bring the thread in front of it and actually pull the thread into that disc firmly. Bring it in front of it, around it, and then back over to the bobbin. Put several turns on the bobbin. I always say 6 or 7 turns in a clockwise direction. Push the bobbin over to the bobbin winder button and step on the foot control. And off we go. Now if it doesn't start right off, just grab that tail and go ahead and wind that bobbin. Now you will see that as I'm winding, I'm firmly in the tension disc. You can wind a full spool if you like, or if you're only going to do a little bit of sewing, just wind a half a spool. If you choose to wind a full spool of thread, your bobbin will stop automatically. And I'm just going to stop about half full because I know today we won't use that full bobbin. Push that bobbin back from the bobbin winder and take the bobbin off. Now I want to mention one thing that's really important. If you ever sit down to sew and your machine is just making that noise and it's not sewing, that's probably because your bobbin winder is on. So simply push it to the left and now you'll be back in sewing position. All right, the other thing, of course, we have to do is to tighten that hand wheel again so that the needle will go up and down. That's real easy to do. Just grasp the outer one, turn the inner one away from you now. Right is tight. That's a good way to remember it. And now we're ready to put the bobbin into our sewing machine. We go to the bobbin area, and on the left side, there's actually a little finger grip that we can get our fingers into to open that little door toward us. And then on the bobbin case, there's actually another little finger grip that we can get a hold of there. You can just take a hold of that little grip and pull that case out. Now I'll take the bobbin out that's already in there, and I'll take my bobbin that I've wound, and I will put that bobbin into that bobbin case. You want to put it in there so that the thread is pulling back into this little slot on the side. So we put the bobbin in, pull the thread back into that little slot, and then up into what we call the tension spring. So up into that tension spring firmly. And you'll actually hear it click in there. Now, when you pull on the thread, the bobbin will turn clockwise. If it's turning counterclockwise, you've got it in backwards. Just take it out and put it in the other way around. Okay, once our bobbin is firmly into the bobbin case, if you grasp that little finger grip again, that will hold the bobbin into the case while you put it into the machine. Push it in right onto that spindle, and then take your finger, and you'll notice that I pushed it in with that long finger up, and really wiggle it around in there till it snaps in. Let's do that one more time. This finger needs to be up. We put it into the machine. We wiggle it around until it snaps in firmly. That's really important that it be in firm. Okay, now we've wound the bobbin and put it into the machine. We're halfway there, ready to sew almost. We're going to thread the top. So take the thread out of that tension spring. That's only for bobbin winding. And bring it instead behind there. There's a little hook that we go into right behind the tension spring. Down to the front, there's a little guide that we go into from the right. So it's slotted. Just take the thread behind that little hook, down into this guide from the right. And then once you're in there, the next is to go around the tension. Now this is actually the tension dial. There are discs in there that put tension on the thread. It's important to be clicked into the discs. Lay it on that little silver piece that's sticking out, slide it in and around and into this little spring. So you go under the little spring on the other side. And once you're under there, hold the thread firmly with your hand so it can't move, and give it a tug up. And that will get you into the tension. If your spring is not moving, you have no tension on your thread, and you'll want to rethread that tension. It's very important. Now, once you've threaded the tension, we go to the take-up lever. That's this little lever right here, and we're going to go into that, and you'll see that it's slotted. We simply go in, and we're ready to go. Then down into the guide just above the needle here, or halfway down, and then one right above the needle there. So, take-up lever, guide, and above the needle. Of course, the final step is to thread the needle. It's a good idea to cut your thread so that you have a nice blunt cut. You thread the needle from front to back, and that white behind it makes it a lot easier to thread. Now, it's time to bring up the bobbin thread. Hold the top thread firmly with your left hand and turn the hand wheel one full turn. And as you do that, what will happen is a loop will form, and you can actually pull that bobbin thread to the top. Now, be sure when you start to sew that those threads are both always under the foot and behind. And there is a thread cutter back here too on the presser bar if you want to make them a little bit shorter, like so. So make sure your threads are under the foot and behind, and that your bobbin door is closed before you start to sew. Now, two other things I want to mention. We talked about the tension dial. Normally between 4 and 6 would be the normal tension setting. As we turn this to the right in a higher number, the discs in there are pressed tighter on the thread, and your top tension will get tighter. As we loosen it and go to a lower number, the tension gets looser. A good little test for you to run to be sure you're threaded correctly is pull your top thread with the presser foot up. Now, on the back is a lever called the presser foot lever. when you lower that lever, the presser foot goes down and you go into sewing position. When you lower that lever, your thread should not pull. You have tension on the thread. That means you're threaded correctly and you're ready to get going sewing. One more button I'd like to point out, and that is our presser foot pressure right here on the top. This actually can be released by pressing on the outer ring, and if you did that, there wouldn't be any push on the fabric. That button regulates how much push the foot puts on the fabric. For normal sewing, we want that button pushed down about halfway so that the fabric will feed well. Well, I think we're about ready to get going and see what stitches we can do. Your new white sewing machine has more than 18 stitch functions, and those stitch functions are actually stitched with the stitches that are pictured on the front of your white 1418. Now, these stitches are actually controlled by 3 different dials. You'll see right to the right of the panel is a width dial, and we'll be talking about that, but the outer rim controls the width of the zigzag, for example. For straight stitch, we want to leave that at the 0 position. The inside of that dial is actually needle position. Turn it to the right, the needle goes to the right. Turn it to the left, the needle goes to the left. When it's in the center, your needle is in the center of the foot. Below that dial is your stitch length dial. And as you can see, this goes as long as 4 and as short as 0. Now 0 would mean the stitch wasn't sewing, it wasn't moving at all, it would be stitching in place. Normal sewing is done right about 2.5 for standard straight stitching. And the reverse button, which we'll be talking about in just a minute. So I think we need to get going sewing. We will set up for the straight stitch, and as I said, the straight stitch is the most used stitch in sewing, and that would be width 0, center needle position, length for normal straight sewing between 2.5 and 3. Place your fabric under the presser foot. There actually are seam lines to guide you when you're sewing a garment. And so I will place the fabric under the foot and in from the edge slightly, and then lower the presser foot. Now remember, it's very important to put that presser foot down or you won't have any tension on the top thread. Step on the foot control and begin to sew. Now as we sew, you can see that we're stitching our straight stitch along the fabric. When you stop sewing, be sure to stop with the needle in the highest position and the take-up lever coming out of the top of the machine. That way, when you raise the presser foot, your threads will pull out easily. Now you can either use the thread cutter at the back, or you can simply use a scissors to cut those threads. But now you see our straight stitch seam that would often be pressed open in the forming of a garment. In other words, I've sewn 2 pieces of fabric together here. We would go to the ironing board and we would press that seam open in a garment situation. There you see it. Now one thing about this straight seam is that it's going to pull out at the beginning and the end. It's not anchored in any way. So let's learn to anchor our seam by using the reverse button on our white sewing machine. So simply place your fabric in from the edge, about 1/2 inch from this edge. You're not going to start sewing right at the edge. And remember, those threads are under the foot and to the back before we begin sewing. So move the fabric up about 1/2 inch, lower the presser foot, and as you begin sewing, you're going to press in on the reverse button. Now I find the easiest way to do this is to grip the side of the machine with your fingers and press in with your thumb. It gives you some leverage. So as I start to sew, I'm sewing forward, but as I push on that reverse button, it will stitch back to the edge of the fabric, and then when I let go of the reverse button, come forward again. Sew to the end of the fabric and stop. When you get to the end of the fabric, you're going to press on that reverse button one more time, and as you do that, while you're holding it in, that will stitch back, and it's called lock stitching or reverse stitching at the beginning and the end of a seam. And there you see our locked off stitches at the beginning and the end. Those are not going to pull out as we start to sew. Okay? Now, What we're going to do next, we can use that as a darning situation also. You could actually put that fabric underneath and mend and darn with that straight stitch and that reverse button. So what I would do would be to hold in the reverse, let it go, hold in the reverse, let it go, and I would be stitching back and forth over a tear to actually mend that tear. So keep that in mind as a wonderful way to mend. Again, stop with that needle in the highest position. Always get in the habit of turning the hand wheel till your needle is up and your take-up lever is up when you stop sewing, so that you can easily pull that fabric out. And here would be a way to darn over a hole, in a tiny hole, for example, in a linen or a towel. Just stitch back and forth over that hole to keep it darned. Now, the straight stitch has a number of other functions. One of the things that I like to do is sometimes baste things to see how they're going to fit. We do that with a longer stitch length. I mentioned that most sewing is done at 2.5 to 3, but if I thought I would want to pull these stitches out, then I would simply lengthen my stitch to say 4, my longest stitch length, and I could run a row of stitching that would have an extra long length and could be easily pulled out when I'm through sewing. So you could try a garment on, see how it fits, and then once you've tried it on to see if it fits you, then you could come back and you could snip some of these threads out and simply take a hold of the bobbin thread from the wrong side, and you'll be amazed that it will just pull right out. The longer the stitch length, the easier your thread will pull out. So when you need to baste, that's a great way to do it. That long basting stitch is also used for gathering, and you will see that if we run 2 rows of gathering stitch, we can then, when I say gathering stitch, it's that long stitch I just ran for basting, but I've run 2 side by side, about 1/4 inch apart. And then we would take a hold of these threads and we would draw up. Usually it's easiest to pull the 2 bobbin threads and draw them up. This would be used for gathering skirts up, for easing sleeves you would pull up like that, but it's very easy to gather with the gathering stitch. All right, so we've learned straight stitch, we've learned how to back stitch, and we've learned how to mend and darn, also how to baste and gather. But there's one more straight stitch function that's a very handy one, and that is top stitching. Now, top stitching is stitching that you see from the right side of a garment. And I have a little project here I was reaching for. This is one of the little projects from the white website, and this is one you're supposed to wear like this. The kids just love these, don't they? And this stitching on the outside that shows where this binding has been stitched in place is actually called top stitching. So anytime you see the stitching, it's top stitching. And so we've stitched the binding in place with a straight stitch called top stitching. By the way, if you'd like the pattern for this little scarf, it's a great one to do with the kids as well. Go to the white website at www.whitesewing.com and print off your own instructions on how to make the little scarf. Top stitching is simply a straight stitch at about a 3 stitch length, and in this case, I'll do center needle position. So as I'm sewing on the top of my garment, my stitching will show. Now I could do it in contrasting thread, or I might do it in a thread that doesn't match, a thread that matches, whichever you prefer. But in this case, I would want to stitch down the middle. Do you see how the needle is in the middle of the foot? When I take my needle position dial and turn it to the left, then my needle moves over to the left of my foot. And so I would have top stitching about 1/4 inch from the edge as I sew with the edge of that fabric. I can also move that needle to the right, and I simply turn that dial to the right to get the right needle position. And now you see the needles over to the right. Sometimes run a row of top stitching in the left position and one next to it in the right position. The needle positions can be very handy for different types of decorative stitching and also for quilting. And speaking of quilting, we do have a quilt that you might like to see. This is also on the website as a project. It's a little autograph quilt. Now you could make it a lot bigger too, but Again, this is exposed top stitching, but in this case, because it's done through batting, we're calling it quilting stitching. And this is very easy to do. Simply layer your batting and your fabric, and then you would take and stitch that quilting stitch. Here you see I have a little calico fabric, I have a little batting, I might draw my quilting design, I'd lower my presser foot, and I would sew, and I could actually quilt whatever design I would like. So stitching through layers of batting and fabric is actually called quilting, and it will give you some loft, as you can see, as you quilt that piece. Finally, the straight stitch would also be used to put in a zipper, and you have a zipper foot with your new white sewing machine. The zipper foot is a snap off and on feet. This is a really nice feature of your white, the fact that you would simply touch the little lever at the back of the foot and the foot that's on will fall off, or snap off, as we say. Now we'll put the zipper foot in place. Now the zipper foot is a special foot that actually has a bar that allows you to snap on the left side of it or the right side of it, and I'll show you why in just a minute. So we would then line up that little bar with the ankle or shank of the foot, and now the foot is in place. And when I have it snapped to the left, I can stitch very close to even the biggest teeth of a zipper on this side. Now I can simply snap that foot off again by touching that little lever and move it over and snap it on the right side of the bar, and you'll see that that would allow me then to stitch close on the other side of the zipper. So follow the instructions in the zipper package, but utilize the zipper foot to get closer to the zipper as you stitch. Well, we've learned a lot about straight stitch. Now, what about zigzag? I'm going to take off that zipper foot, and I'm going to put on, again, my standard sewing foot, which is also known as a zigzag foot because the opening where the needle can swing is wide, and the needle can swing in between there for a zigzag stitch. So here again, to replace the foot, simply line up the bar on the foot with the ankle, bring the ankle down, and click the foot in place. It just snaps on automatically when you put that foot down. Another thing to check from time to time, be sure that this screw is tight that's holding that ankle on. Should it loosen, that foot can drop down and then your machine won't feed correctly. Always again, threads under the presser foot and to the back when you're ready to start sewing. All right, now to get a zigzag stitch, we will simply add width to our stitch. So I'm going back to that width dial. And I'm going to put my needle position back to center, and I'm going to set my width not on 0, because 0 is a straight stitch, but on 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll set it on 5, which is my widest stitch. My length I'm going to leave at about 3.5 to 4, and now I will simply sew, and you'll notice how the needle is swinging from side to side. You see that? Instead of going right down the middle, the needle swings from side to side. Again, we're going to stop with that needle in the highest position, the take-up lever up, and you will see now we have stitched a great little zigzag stitch. Isn't that fun? Side to side. Now this zigzag stitch, of course, can also be different lengths, and it can be different widths. This is the widest width, the widest swing from side to side. If I were to vary my width, then I could have a narrower zigzag. So as I sew, I'm going to turn my dial from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2, and of course if I got back to 1, I'd be at a straight stitch. Again, that needle in the up position, but here you can see how I started with a wide and I went narrower and narrower and narrower all the way down to a straight stitch on my zigzag stitch. So you can vary the width of the zigzag. You can also vary the length of the zigzag stitch. So let's do that now. I'll go back to the widest width, which is 5. I'm going to set the widest width of zigzag, and I'm going to take my length from 4 all the way down. So I'll start at 4, and as I turn the length down to 3, to 2, to 1, almost to 0. Now obviously if I got to 0, the fabric wouldn't be feeding anymore and I'd get a big blob. So I'll show you that too, because we need to know that. But here you can see that as my length got shorter, I went from a long spaced out zigzag at 4 to 3 length to 2 length, down almost to 0, and then when I got to 0, I just stayed in one place. So your zigzag at variable lengths and widths gives you lots of creative opportunities. And one of those is applique. Now, actually, the act of applique is to take one fabric and lay it on another fabric and then stitch it in place with that really close zigzag stitch. So we know now that we have a close zigzag stitch, we would want to get that applique in place. What's best for this is a fusible web, and this is actually a paper-backed product called fusible web that you buy at the fabric store that you stick on the back of your fabric, remove the paper, and then this is the Steam-A-Seam 2 that actually sticks it in place. Now if I iron that, it will be on there firmly. So my applique is stuck in place and I have my stabilizer underneath. This is very important. Stabilizer actually keeps fabric from puckering up as you sew, and you want to use it whenever you're using decorative stitching. I always suggest that for applique, you experiment a little bit on a scrap before you start. Place the fabric underneath the presser foot and set your dials on whatever width you desire. In this case, I'll use about a 4.5 width, I think, but I'm going to go up to about a 2 length, and I'm going to sew, whoops, my needle's unthreaded, and by the way, if that happens to you, I can just tell you that you need to be sure and leave a little bit more of a tail of thread out from the machine and under that presser foot before you start to sew. But fortunately, your new white sewing machine is really easy to thread, and that white behind the needle makes the needle very easy to thread. Satin stitch is a popular technique, also can be used decoratively on garments as a really pretty look. Okay, again, thread under the foot, toward the back, ready to sew on my stabilizer. I'm going to shorten my length as I sew until I get down to a nice fine-tuned satin stitch, which is almost to 0. Now, once you have your satin stitch fine-tuned, then you're going to want to go and stitch around your applique. I'm using the standard presser foot that came with my white 1418. And I will say that for applique, I generally recommend purchasing an accessory foot. We'll just do a little bit here to show you what it looks like. But you can see how that has begun to stitch right around that applique. The reason for purchasing an accessory foot for applique is that this stitching actually builds up kind of a hump of thread. And when you do applique sewing, you want a foot that will feed over that hump. And that's called a satin stitch or applique foot. And do you see the tunnel on the underside of the foot? That's why that foot will feed better than the foot that's on your white, which is totally flat on the underside. So for regular sewing, you want the flat standard foot that came with your white. Look for an accessory satin stitch foot, low shank, for applique and other decorative sewing if you're going to do a lot of that. Well, applique is really fun, but zigzag has a lot more functions. One of the things that we use it the most for is actually to keep things from fraying. And fraying, of course, means that these threads pull off the edge. You may buy things that fray, you may be making a garment. So we're going to sew a zigzag stitch off the edge to trap all those fibers and keep them from fraying off in the future. I'll use my wide width of 5. Now, if my fabric were real lightweight, I might go a little bit narrower, down to 4. And I'll use a length of about 3 to do my overcast. 3, 3.5, depending on the weight of the fabric. Here again, it's always best to experiment on scraps. But now we're going to stitch right off the edge of that fabric. And what this will do is that zigzag stitch will actually trap those threads and keep them from fraying off in the future. Won't that be handy? And again, now we could sew our seam and press it open, and we'd have finished seams on the inside of our garment. So that would be great. Overcasting is another technique, but how about hemming? Would you like to be able to hem by machine? Well, the blind hem stitch is done after you have at the ironing board pressed up your hem. So you can see here that I'm pressing up about 1.5 inches hem, and normally when you pin hems you pin them this way, but we want to pin perpendicular to the hem. In other words, put the pins in. It's a lot easier to do at the ironing board than right here at the sewing machine. Just lay it flat and put those pins in and have the first bite of the pin about 1/4 inch from the edge of the hem, the raw edge. Now you're going to fold this hem under toward the right side, which is going to flip those pins out, and it's also going to flip out an extension of fabric, which is the wrong side of our hem. We will put that under the presser foot, and we'll set our zigzag at the widest width, 5 width zigzag, and at the longest length, 4. So we want the widest width, longest length, and actually it's a good idea to turn the hand wheel by hand and just check the swing of the needle, because you want the left swing of the zigzag to just barely catch this fold back edge, and the right swing of the zigzag to be on the hem itself. Now, I want to mention for sure that we have to pull out these pins as we approach them. We won't be able to sew over them, so be sure you take out the pins before you sew into them. But now as you sew, just keep that lined up so that the left swing of the needle catches the left side and the right swing is on the fabric itself. You'll see here now how we have caught the fold with that zigzag to the left, and the rest of the zigzag is on the single layer of fabric. Now when we fold to the right side, you can see that we just barely see where we've caught that zigzag. If you use a matching thread, you won't even see those little picks of thread for your blind hem. Many machines have a special stitch for this, and that might be something that you'd look forward to as you learn to sew and do a lot more sewing with your white 1418. You might move up to a white that has a blind hem and some of the other decorative stitches. Well, how about sewing buttons? Sewing buttons is something that really can be tedious by hand, and I don't know about you, mine never stay on very well when I'm doing it by hand. So how about stitching them on by machine? Well, your white came with a special foot for sewing on buttons. So we'll snap off, touch that little button, the regular zigzag presser foot, and we'll put the button foot. Now, if you take a hold of that presser foot lift, you have a little extra lift. That'll help you just raise it up and get that under there, and then snap that buttonhole foot, that button foot. It's the one with the blue button sewing foot in place. I've actually taped my button on with Scotch tape or transparent tape. Transparent's the best because it doesn't stick to the needle. And I'm going to now line up the holes of the button with the swing of the needle. But there's something really important here. We'll go back to those dials, because right now this fabric is going to feed and I want it to stay in one place. So that my fabric stays in one place, I'm going to put the length on 0. That means there's no length, the fabric won't feed forward. I'm going to adjust the width of the stitch so that the zigzag needle swing drops into the holes of the button. Now before I step on that foot control, trust me, we're going to turn that hand wheel by hand. But what do we have to remember? Put the presser foot down before we begin to sew and line up the holes with the swing of the needle. In most cases, I think you'll find that about 4.5 is the place to be. Once you're lined up, and you make sure that it's going into the holes by hand, so I'm turning the hand wheel by hand right now, then simply step on the foot control and take a few stitches, and look at that. Now, to knot off this button so that it won't pull out, what I like to do is go back to those dials, and I'm going to go to that left needle position so that I know the needle will go into the left hole, and the 0 width, and again I'll try it with my hand first to be sure I'm over the hole. Sure enough I am. And now I'll just take a few stitches in place to knot off. Believe me, this button is firmly in place. If you had a 4-hole button, you simply would jump to the next 2 holes and go. If you had more buttons, just have them all taped on and you can jump down. And once your button's on, simply pull off the tape and your button's all firmly in place, ready to button into a buttonhole. Well, I guess that's my cue to do a buttonhole for you. And your new white 418 came with a wonderful buttonhole foot that actually has markings on it. So again, I'll snap off that button sewing foot, and again I might need that extra lift to slide it out, and I will snap on my buttonhole foot. Again, just line up the little bar with the shank or ankle, push down, and your buttonhole foot will snap on. There we go. You want to hear those feet snap on before you start to sew. Now what's great about this buttonhole foot, you may want to mark your buttonhole on your fabric. Usually we do with a fabric marking pencil. And I would suggest for the best sewing, get this thread all under the foot. And you can do that, I'm trying to do it so you can see, by pushing that top thread under the foot and to the back before you start to sew. Okay? The foot actually has marking increments on it. And if you go back 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, you can actually determine the length of your buttonhole. Normally you will have it marked on the fabric. So pull the buttonhole foot so that the end of the buttonhole at the back lines up with the back of your buttonhole, and the end of the buttonhole foot at the front lines up with the front of your buttonhole. Now we'll go back to those dials, because the first thing we're going to stitch is our bar tack. So I will set my width at 5, my needle position in the center, and my length at 0, because the end of the buttonhole being a bar tack, we don't want the fabric to move. Once I'm set, I simply take a few stitches, and this will be stitches in place. Don't take too many. 4 is probably enough. If you get too many, you'll get a big hump of stitches there that you can't stitch over. I've learned that the hard way. All right, so our bar tack is complete. Now we want to sew the left side of the buttonhole. So we go back to our dials, and the left side, of course, is narrower. So I'm going to put the width right at that little marking. It's actually a twin needle, and we'll learn about that in a minute, between 2 and 3. And I'm going to sew the left side of the buttonhole, so I'm going to move my needle position to the left. So I click the middle dial to the left, and I want to move now. I want to move forward on this left side of the buttonhole, and I want to satin stitch. So I will move my dial close to 0. Remember, for applique, that satin stitch. Now we begin sewing. And down will come our buttonhole sewing, the left side of that column. It's always good to make a sample. When your foot stops moving and you get back to your first mark, now you're ready for the bar tack at the end. It's important to always have the needle out of the fabric when you're changing dials. Otherwise it will shift the fabric and ruin your buttonhole. So needle up, go back to the dials. We're going to do a bar tack. So bar tack, remember, was the wide width, the center needle, and the 0 stitch length. Stitch in place. So take again 3, 4, 5 stitches of a bar tack. Again, don't take too many or you won't feed back over. It'll be a hump of thread there. All right, now we're ready for the right side of the buttonhole. So we go back to our width. The right side is narrow, so we want that narrower width of about 2.5. And it's the right side, so we turn the dial of the needle position to the right to get the right side of the buttonhole. And we need length so that our machine will feed. Now, I'm going to set my length, but if we think about it, the machine would want to feed forward, and we need to go backward to do the right side of our buttonhole. Well, we know from before that going backwards is easy. We simply push that R for reverse. So to sew the right side of the buttonhole, hold the reverse button in place as you stitch back to where you started, and you will have a beautiful buttonhole ready to button your button into. It's that easy. Now you may need a little help with this. Consult your instruction book or watch the video a couple of times and sew right along with me as you make your first or second buttonhole. And again, remember, always do some on a scrap and stabilize your buttonholes. I'm using one of the stitch and tear type stabilizers, but usually in a garment you would be reinforced with interfacing, but it's still a good idea to put a stabilizer underneath. All right, well, we've done some fun things, but here's a real fun one coming up. I'm going to snap off that buttonhole foot and set it aside and put my standard sewing foot back on, because we're going to talk about twin needle sewing, which gives you twice as many options with your new white sewing machine. To change the needle, you simply loosen the needle clamp screw. And remember, right is tight, so left is loose. So we're going to turn it towards us, and if it's too tight, which mine is, you got a little screwdriver in your accessory kit, and there's a little screw slot there. So simply turn the screw toward you until the needle pulls right out. So I'll set that needle aside, and I'm going to replace it with a twin needle. Now this would be an accessory that you would buy at a sewing machine store, and they come in different widths. But just know that you would buy a standard twin needle. Actually, the only difference between these is brand, and the blue top indicates it's for knits, and the red top for standard sewing. So I have now my twin needle, and the shank or ankle on this needle is exactly the same as the ankle on a regular needle. It's flat on one side. So I take that shank or ankle and I put it up into my needle clamp screw as far as it will go, and then I turn to the right to tighten that needle clamp screw. Now we see we have two needles coming out of one shank. Obviously, two needles will require two threads. So we're going to take a second spool of thread, and we'll pull up our second spool holder and put that spool of thread on the top. And this will be a good review, because we thread the twin needle second thread just the way we threaded the twin needle first thread. We go into that little hook at the top, we go down into the first guide, we hold the thread firmly as we go around the tension, and we click it up into the tension till we have tension on the spring, up over that take-up lever, into the guide that's about halfway down the faceplate. Now there's only one difference, and I generally leave one of my twin needle threads out of this final guide and put one in. And the reason for that is that I can then keep them from tangling just above the needle. So I'll thread my right needle, and then once my right needle's threaded, I'll thread my left needle. I'm using only one bobbin. We want to point that out. So this would be work that you would do only from the top. And the bobbin thread will be like a zigzag. I'll show you in a minute, that swings from side to side. Here again, place those threads under the presser foot and toward the back before you begin to sew. Now, twin needle sewing, the neat thing about this for top stitching, you'll get two rows that are perfectly straight with one another. So let's do straight stitch first. Straight stitch twin needle sewing, we'll go to width 0. Remember, width 0 is always a straight stitch. We'll have our center needle position, and we'll use a length of about 3.5 or 3, which would be a good top stitching length. Twin needle is often used for top stitching. Now as we sew, both of those needles are stitching a row of stitching. Again, stop with that take-up lever and needle in the highest position, and here we see two rows of stitching exactly straight with one another, side by side. And I'll show you the back, because there you see the zigzag bobbin swinging back and forth. But wouldn't this be great for top stitching? This is wonderful on knits too, because it has a little elasticity to it. But you can also stitch twin needle sewing with a zigzag stitch. So we'll set our stitch width to about 2.5, and you'll notice that that's that little twin needle. And that's a reminder to you that when you do twin needle sewing, don't ever set the stitch width wider than that. And I'll show you why. Because when we put our fabric underneath the presser foot and lower our presser foot, anytime you're doing a zigzag with twin needle, I suggest that you turn the hand wheel by hand to be sure that the needle swings in the hole and doesn't hit the foot. If the width is too wide, the needle will hit the foot and of course will break. If you stick with the settings and with about a 2 to 2.5 width needle, you'll be okay. But now you can see that we have a really pretty stitching that is caused when we sew with that twin needle sewing. Isn't that neat? So you can do a lot of decorative things with that. And remember, it's a zigzag that you could shorten up or lengthen as well. And you could make it a little bit narrower or maybe a smidge wider. So twin needle sewing is really fun and gives you a lot of really great options. Now, the final decorative stitching that we'd like to share actually is free motion sewing. So I'm going to remove that twin needle and set it aside, and I'm going to pull off one of those threads because we only need one for our free motion sewing. I'll replace it with the standard needle. Now I usually find the easiest way to do this is to drop it down into the hole a little bit and then come straight up. It helps me find where it's going. If you ever drop it in, don't sew until you've found it, okay? It's happened to me where I've just dropped it by some mistake. Then I just stop and open up my bobbin door and find the needle, take the bobbin case out to look for it before I begin sewing again. All right, so I put it in flat edge to the back. I turned that needle clamp screw to hold it in place. And now we're going to do some free motion sewing. And this is something we use for monogramming, embroidery. We also can do stipple quilting. So the first thing to do is to take the presser foot and the ankle off of your white sewing machine. I'm actually going to completely remove the screw so it's out of the way, and the foot and the ankle. We'll just set those aside. We're going to use just the needle and the presser bar. Now because there's no foot pushing down on the fabric, we're going to have a way to keep it taut and against the stitch plate. So I'm going to use a hoop, and this is actually a hoop that was designed especially for machine stitching. You could use a wood one as long as it would go underneath. And my fabric is large enough to fit in the hoop and a piece of stabilizer underneath, large enough to fit in the hoop. This is the reverse of hand embroidery, by the way. Put the large hoop down against the table and the smaller hoop on the top, and you're going to be working in the hoop this way, not this way as you do for hand embroidery. So you have the inner hoop up. Now, I want a flatter surface to work on, so this is a good place to slide on my flatbed extension piece. Just line up the little holes and slide it in place. And now put the hoop underneath that presser bar. Now first we'll do some stipple quilting or straight stitch or seed stitch embroidery. So for straight stitch, remember, our stitch width goes to 0. So we put our stitch width on 0, center needle position would be the best to use, and we will use what length? Well, we don't want those feed teeth moving the fabric at all. So to keep the feed teeth from moving the fabric, we will put the length on 0. That means we will have feed teeth stitching in place. Now before we begin, we'll bring up the bobbin thread, and we do that just the way we brought up the bobbin thread in the beginning. We hold the top thread in our left hand, we take one full turn of the wheel till a little loop stitch is formed, and then we pull that loop to the top before we begin sewing. Now here's the hardest thing to remember in free motion sewing, and if you don't remember it, you're going to have a big jam underneath. You have to remember to put the presser foot down. In other words, it's not going to bring a foot down, but if you look closely, it will bring the bar down. Most importantly, what it does is engages the tension of the thread. So if you do a lot of free motion work, you may need to put a sign on the front of the machine that says, "Put the foot down." All right, I'll step on the foot control, I'll hold the hoop with my fingers, keep these fingers out of the way of the needle, but keep them on the fabric, and now I simply go ahead and sew. And this would be straight stitch stitching. I could write my name, I could actually do stippling. Stippling is a real popular quilting technique right now. I have a little sample of it here, but all we do is just go back and forth with the straight stitch. We could outline quilt as well. But here's an example of some stipple quilting on this little purse, which is another one of the white projects on that white website, www.whitesewing.com. And so it might be one of the projects you'd want to try to practice your stipple quilting. Now, to do other embroidery and monogramming, you can give your stitch width. And what we'll do is set our stitch width almost, well, I'll set it all the way to 5. If you wanted a very narrow letter or monogram, you could set it narrower. Again, we'll leave the length at 0 because we want to stitch in place. We could draw our word or our name on with a pen or one of the fabric marking pens. But now as we sew, you'll see, be sure that presser foot is down, yes it is, that the needle swings from side to side. Now, what we can do is we can go ahead and we can, if we had drawn our word on, we could just follow that marking pen, or you can use this needle as a pencil. And you can actually go ahead and write a word or embroider a leaf by simply moving the fabric. Now, remember, you have to move the fabric. If you don't move the fabric, it's going to just sit in one place. This does take a little bit of practice, but don't be afraid of it. Just keep your fingers out of the way of the needle, and you can do some wonderful machine embroidery. What do you all think? Has it been fun today? Well, we've learned all kinds of techniques to do on the new white 1418, but we need to know one more thing. It's important to take good care of your new white sewing machine. And so our technician, Bob Bittner, and his daughter are going to help us with that.
So go ahead and remove the needle. We're going to throw that away. We'll put a new needle in when we put it back together.
Okay.
Next thing we're going to do is you're going to take your bobbin case out. You remember how to take the bobbin case out? You've got that little latch assembly there?
Pull this up?
Right. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take this hook cover off. In order to take this off, you're going to take these two little arms right here and basically pull them out so it'll take and release the hook cover inside.
Okay.
Great. Next thing you're going to do is take the hook cover off. Okay, and one thing you're going to find about the hook cover also, if you notice, there's two pins on the outside here. That's where those two locking arms hold it in place. Then you've got a little pin on the bottom that helps locate it when you put it back inside the machine. That little locating pin goes on the bottom. That way you can't put it in wrong.
Okay.
All right, next thing you're going to do, you're actually going to take the hook out of this machine and we're going to clean it out. The hook is right here and you can grab that little post in the middle and pull it straight out. Now if you notice on this hook, that's why they call it a hook. It's got a very sharp end on it. You don't want to stick yourself with that, hurt yourself, or you don't want to drop it and break the point of that off, because if you do, it won't pick the thread up when you go to form a stitch.
Okay.
If you take a look down inside there, you're going to see we have some dirt down in there. Once in a while you'll find thread, dirt, grease, whatever. Okay, we're going to clean that out. Before you do that though, you may want to take a piece of scrap material or an old piece of paper towel or something. Wipe out whatever you can wipe out. Get as much of that junk out of there as you can. That should be good. Okay. The next thing you're going to do, these are real handy to have around the house. It's a mini vac attachment.
Okay.
What that does, that just hooks up to your vacuum cleaner, and you can get down inside there. I'll turn it on here for you in a second. You can get down inside there and clean all the dust and dirt and everything else that's left inside the machine. It's a lot better to take and use a vacuum cleaner because you're actually going to suck the dirt out.
Okay.
Ready to go?
Yep.
Here we go.
Now that we've taken apart and cleaned it, what do we do next, Dad?
Well, next thing we're going to do, we're going to put it back together and oil it.
Okay.
All right. One of the first things you want to do is you're going to grab your hook, and again, be careful because it's got that sharp point on it. Put your hook back in. Got it? Good. Next thing you want to do is you want to put a little bit of oil in there.
What kind of oil? Like cooking oil or the oil you put in your car?
We have special sewing machine oil that's made specifically for sewing machines.
Okay.
All right. All you want to do is take and put just one little drop right down inside the hook area here, where the hook rotates back and forth because it's an oscillator. Go ahead.
Okay.
You always want to read your owner's manual. It'll tell you where to put oil and if the machine requires oil or not.
Okay.
All right. Now that we've got that done, next thing you want to do is put your hook cover back on. When you put your hook cover back on, it's always easier if the feed dogs are up, so you can rotate the hand wheel around. Put the hook cover on. You got that locating pin on the bottom. Good. Set it in place like you did. and then put your two locking arms back down. Make sure they click into place. Great. Now, last but not least, you want to put your bobbin case back in. When you put it in, make sure you have the thread for the bobbin that runs underneath that spring right there. Great. Okay, one other thing you also want to do is you want to lubricate the needle bar.
Okay.
If you watch the needle bar, you can see it moving up and down. You want to put a little drop of oil on top and on the bottom of it. Wipe off any extra dirt, and again, that'll help keep the noise level down, and it'll run smoother for you.
Now's the time to get going sewing on your new white sewing machine. There are many resources available to help you. Be sure to visit your local sewing machine store and your fabric store and ask about classes and sewing clubs. And look for sewing books and magazines. There's lots of them that can help you learn more about sewing and gain many new projects for the home. And the other thing, watch those television programs like So Young, So Fun and America Sews and other how-to crafting, sewing, and quilting programs. They'll teach you more about sewing. Plus, go to the WIPE website to see some of the projects, www.whitesewing.com. The little Button Me Up Baby, now that you know how to sew buttons and buttonholes. Reversible placemats using that satin stitch zigzag as the edge stitching. And there's an applique pillow project. So until next time, happy sewing!